Good morning. Let's try it again. Good morning. All right. Didn't Olivia do an amazing job last week? Olivia did an amazing job. I listened online as she was preaching and sent her a text. I just want to let her know, she was doing a great job. Such a gift for preaching, so thank you for being a part of this. And I don't know if Taylor mentioned this last week whenever she was introducing Olivia, but this is really Olivia's sermon series. It's part of her coursework at ACU. She's working on this MDiv, and part of her course was putting together a sermon series, preaching through this sermon series. And so she had brought this up earlier before the summer. Could we do this? Could I preach some? And so I wanted to be a part of that and help out with that. And so this is hers. I mean, she put the sermon series together, and I've been walking by her side and helping her, but I mean, this is ultimately hers, and she laid it out and told me what to preach. I'm just glad to be a part of it, and so we're going to get to hear her a few more times throughout this series, and so I know it's going to be great, and so you did a great job last week. Thank you, and I'm honored to be a part of preaching this with you. Maybe you've had this happen before. Here, when we have staff meetings, and usually it's not necessarily really our staff meetings, it's more the meetings where the ministry staff and the elders are together. We occasionally have those meetings. Inevitably, someone will say in those meetings at some point, we're getting too far into the weeds. Are you familiar with that phrasing? Getting too far in the weeds. And usually it's Dennis Odell who says that. We're getting too far in the weeds. We'll get in these meetings and we'll start talking about the big ideas and big picture of things, but then at some point as we're talking about the big picture and the big ideas, we'll start narrowing down and we'll get really into every little minute detail, and we'll start covering all the what ifs and how abouts, and before long, you're so deep in all the what ifs and how abouts and every minute detail that you're losing sight of the big picture, you're losing sight of the big idea, and sometimes, because of all the what ifs and the how abouts that honestly never really come to fruition, you get paralyzed and you become fearful because of all the what ifs and the how abouts, and you never really get to move forward. You never really act on the thing that you're talking about. And so we'll find ourselves in those meetings getting down in the weeds, talking about the what ifs and how abouts and all that stuff. And someone will always have to say, hey guys, we're getting too far in the weeds here. We need to take a step back, right? We can talk about this stuff later, or other people can talk about it in other settings, but right now, we need to get out of the weeds. We're getting too far into the weeds. Now, that's relevant today because, one, our sermon today is on the parable about weeds. And so in a few moments, we're going to be looking at a parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 13 about weeds. But it's also relevant for another reason. Olivia and I are doing this series on parables, and the thing is, if we're not too careful, and we've had this discussion a few times, if we're not too careful, we can find ourselves getting too far in the weeds with these parables. And what do I mean by that? Well, I've recently kind of stumbled upon an irony in preaching the parables. And for me, like I said, I just recently kind of stumbled upon this irony. And so what is the irony of preaching parables? Well, the irony is this. Jesus seems to tell parables because he wanted there to be a little mystery to what he's trying to say. Jesus seems to tell parables because by their very nature, parables are a little vague. They're a little mysterious. They're even a little ambiguous. Now, it's not the way I was brought up looking at parables. I was taught growing up that Jesus tells parables because they're the easiest thing to understand, that he tells parables because, people wouldn't understand if he told them in other ways, and so he had to give them parables because they were simple and straightforward. If you go back and see what Jesus says about parables, you'll go, wait a minute, that's not right. Parables are mysterious and vague, so much so that the disciples on different occasions had to pull him aside and say, okay, what in the world was that about? So there's a discussion that goes on in Matthew chapter 13. It's not necessarily our topic today, but I do want us to look at it. the disciples go to Jesus and say, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" In other words, what they're saying is, why don't you just come out and tell them what you want to tell them? Why don't you just speak plainly? But instead, what you're doing is you're speaking in parables, because disciples found parables to be a bit mysterious and a bit vague and a little hard to understand. Listen to Jesus' response. He says, "Well, I do it because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but it's not been given to them. For those who have will receive more, and they will have more than enough. But as for those who don't have, even the little bit they have will be taken away from them. This is why I speak to the crowds in parables, because although they see, they don't really see. And although they hear, they don't really hear or understand." Now, I don't fully comprehend everything that Jesus is saying here, but it sounds like he's saying, okay, disciples, you've been given a glimpse into the kingdom. You've been able to see behind the curtain. You've been given a revelation of the mystery, but not everyone has been given that revelation. Not everyone has been given a glimpse behind the curtain of the mystery. And so get this, he says, so I tell parables to keep the mystery alive. I don't tell parables because they're easy for them to understand. No, he says, I tell parables to keep the mystery alive. I speak in parables, he says, because I'm trying to remain vague, so that those who hear it and maybe want to know more, they'll be drawn to me to ask for more, but those who hear it and don't get it, they just won't get it. And herein lies the irony of preaching parables. Because preaching by its very nature is intended to get in the weeds. Right? Preaching by its very nature is meant to take a text, to dissect it and break it apart and help make people understand it a little bit better, but parables don't want to be treated that way. If you get too far in the weeds and you start breaking it down and dissecting it, you start removing the mystery. And so, how do you preach parables while keeping the mystery intact? How do you preach parables and not get so far in the weeds that you've all of a sudden taken away all the vagueness and the mystery of it? And that's been the challenge Olivia and I have talked about on a few occasions, talking about preaching these parables. How can we do this in such a way that we're faithful to the practice of preaching, but we're also faithful to parables, and we're not getting so far in the weeds that we remove all mystery from these parables that we're looking at? So that's our challenge as we go through this series. Now, speaking of getting into the weeds, let's get into this parable about weeds. This is in Matthew 13. Again, all these parables that we're looking for is coming from Matthew 13. Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30. He put before them another parable, because again, he says in Matthew 13, we're told, he only spoke to the people in parables. So he puts before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the servants of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" And he answered, "An enemy has done this." And so the servant said to him, "Well then, do you want us to go and gather them all up?" But he replied, "No. For in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. So let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." This is the word of the Lord to us today. Now, some of you may already know this, but for those of you that do not, in total transparency, a little later in Matthew 13, Jesus actually gives his disciples an explanation of this parable. The disciples pull him aside, ask him, what was this parable about? He gives them an explanation for the parable. But if you will allow me, I'm not going to touch on his explanation. Not because I think it's wrong. Are we all clear on that? Not because I think Jesus is wrong, That would be awful, wouldn't it? But I do believe that parables, like the rest of the Bible, I believe that parables are living and breathing. And like most of the rabbis during Jesus' day, I believe that parables can say different things at different times to different people in different contexts. And so if you will allow me, I'm not really going to touch on Jesus' explanation, but I am going to talk about some other things that jump out at me in this parable. Some things that maybe Jesus doesn't address in his explanation. So you've got this farmer who plants good seed. And then at night, while they're all asleep, an enemy of his comes in among all the good seed that has been planted, and this enemy plants weeds among the wheat. Then some time passes, right? Things are starting to grow and sprout. And the servants notice that as the wheat is growing and sprouting, that weeds are growing right alongside all the wheat. Now, I don't know if they are being accusatory or not, but that's kind of the tone that I hear when I read this. Whenever the servants go to the master and they say, wait a minute, didn't you plant good seed? If that's true, then where did this bad stuff come from? Right? Didn't you plant only good seed out there? Was this a mistake on your part? The farmer says, no, this is not a mistake on my part, but actually what's happened is an enemy has come in the middle of the night and planted the weeds among the wheat that I planted. Now, a little side note here, this would actually touch on reality during the people of Jesus' day, because in Jesus' day, there were always land disputes among farmers. There were always land disputes and produce disputes, so much so, it was so common that Roman law made it a punishable crime to go onto someone else's land and plant weeds. And so this isn't like some crazy scenario that Jesus has created here in this parable, but a scenario that would have been pretty common in that time. And so he says, no, an enemy has come and done this. Well, trying to be the good servants that they are, they say, well, then why don't you let us go clean it up for you? Why don't you let us go out there and pull up all the weeds? But the farmer says no. He says, no. Let them grow together. Let them grow together until harvest. Let them grow together? That doesn't make sense to me. Doesn't make sense to me at all. Last week, Olivia did her sermon on the parable of the one who goes out and sows seed, and all the seed lands on different soils. Do you remember that there's actually a soil that some of the seed gets thrown on, and it was a soil that was full of weeds and thorns? Do you remember what happened to the good seed whenever it all grew up? The weeds and the thorns choked out the good seed, not allowing it to grow, preventing the good from being able to grow. And so you got a parable right before this that talks about how weeds actually choke out the good seed and prevent it from growing. And now you got a parable where the farmer says, let the weeds and the wheat grow together. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't sound like very good farming strategy to me. Let them both grow together? I have never claimed to be a good farmer. I have never claimed to be any good at gardening, and quite honestly, I don't care to be good at gardening. It's not something that really interests me. Growing stuff doesn't really... Alex loves it. He talked to me a while back about all these seeds he wanted to buy and stuff. And it doesn't do anything for me. And so I've never claimed to be a good farmer. I've never claimed to have a green thumb to let anything grow. But here's where I excel. I excel at letting weeds grow. Anybody else with me? Got a few people here. I excel at letting weeds grow. And let me tell you, it's like that first parable that Olivia preached on. In my experience, the weeds choke out the good seed and prevent it from growing. We got a place in our backyard. It's kind of in the back corner, and man, I've tried Kate and I both have tried like our best to keep this little area. It's like got surrounded by rocks and stuff. The people that lived there before us had it, and we just have never done away with it. And so I've tried to like make it look nice, but man, year after year, a bunch of weeds just get in there to the point that finally Kate and I are just like, we'll just wait until winter kills it all off. And honestly, you go and look and you can't see any of the good stuff in that corner of our backyard because the weeds have just taken over and just choking everything out. And I read this parable and I go, let them both grow together? It doesn't make any sense to me. So I want to go back to this idea of mystery. So I talked about how parables are meant to have a mystery to them, but it's not that parables are just meant to have a little bit of mystery to them. Parables are also in some ways supposed to address a mystery, or if not really address the mystery, at least highlight the mystery a little bit. Now, the question is, what mystery might this parable be highlighting? What mystery might this parable be addressing? And I wonder, have you ever thought, and I don't even have to ask really this question, even though I'm going to ask it anyway, but I know for a fact that everybody in this room has had this thought at some point. Have you ever wondered why in the world a good God would let bad people not just exist, but let them thrive and succeed and grow in this world? Anybody had that thought? Have you ever thought, like, why in the world would a good God let bad people coexist side by side with the good people? When the good God from the text that we read does not like all the bad things that are happening in this world. He doesn't want them to happen. If that is true and God doesn't want those things to happen, then why does that God let the bad grow with the good? It's sort of like the servants who go to the master and say, I thought you planted good seed. If that's true, then explain the bad. I thought you only did good things. If that's true, then explain where all these weeds came from. See, it's bad farming. You don't let weeds grow with the wheat because the weeds will eventually choke out the wheat. The weeds will eventually choke it all out and prevent it from growing. The weeds will eventually take over. And so what do whenever we see that happening in this world? Well, what we do is we turn and try to pretend that we're like the servants and we go, hey, God, how about you let us go take care of it for you? How about you let us go and uproot all the weeds in this world? If you just let us just have a little bit of time and a little bit of freedom, we could take care of all this right now. And we all become like the righteous police or the morality police or worse yet, the doctrinal police. Just let us go pull all the weeds, God. But the farmer says, no. Let them grow together. Let them grow together. Why? Why let them grow together? Well, he says, because in your zealousness to uproot the weeds from the garden, you may actually end up pulling up the wheat as well. Now, some of this has to do with the roots, right? It has to do with what's going on underground. You let things grow long enough, the roots get long enough, they start intermingling and intertwining with one another. And so you let these weeds and this wheat start growing. At some point, you go to pull out a weed. Its roots underground have intertwined with some of the wheat roots, and you're pulling up the wheat as well. And now you've pulled out both the good and the bad. But I think there's more to it than just that. There's a particular kind of weed that this particular parable is addressing and it's talking about, and it's in some translations called a tare, in other translations called a darnel. And a tare or a darnel, I don't know if you know this, and I didn't know this until I studied it, it looks exactly like wheat. Especially in the early stages. It's indistinguishable. Unless you're like a professional, it's indistinguishable between wheat. You can't tell a darnel from a wheat. And so who am I? Who am I to think, one, that it's my job to clean God's garden? Who am I to think that it's my job to go out there and pull the weeds? That's one. But the other one is this. Who am I to think that I am wise enough or insightful enough to be able to accurately distinguish wheat from weeds? It takes some real audacity to think that that's my job and that I'm good enough to actually do it. It takes some real audacity on my part to think that I've got it so perfectly figured out that I know exactly what a weed is and I know exactly the wheat, and I can go out there and I can separate them. Heaven forbid that what I am so certain is a weed actually turns out to be wheat. Or flip it, heaven forbid that what I am so certain is wheat and I'm giving my life to and following turns out to be weed. Right? I shouldn't say weed, I should say weeds. I did that first service too. Some of you laughed a little too hard. Why does a good God let bad people and good people coexist side by side? I don't know. I don't fully know. I don't get it. All I know is that the master farmer says, let them both grow together until harvest. And he's got a plan for it, right? He's got a plan in the end. He knows what he's going to do at the end. I don't have to get it. I don't have to understand it. I don't even have to like it. But the thing is I am not called, and neither are you, I am not called to be the servants who think it's their job to clean the garden. All I'm called to do is be good seed. Just be good seed. And produce good fruit where I am. You see, none of us are really quite sure how to distinguish weeds from wheat. Now, there are times where it's easy to tell the difference, but more often than not, it's probably a little harder to tell the difference because they look so alike. And seriously, do you really think you look like wheat all the time? I think we all fluctuate between looking like wheat and looking like weeds. Am I right, Taylor? I think we all fluctuate. And here's the thing, I am grateful. I'm so thankful that no one has decided to try to uproot me in my more weed-like moments. Because here's the thing, the farmer is patient. And maybe that really is the mystery that this parable is addressing, is that God is patient. God is patient. And in God's kingdom, all seed, whether that seed be good or that seed be bad, in God's kingdom, all seed is given the time and the opportunity to show who they truly are. But here's the other thing. God's garden may be the only garden in the world where weeds have the opportunity to turn into wheat. That doesn't happen anywhere else. But in God's garden, in God's kingdom, in His garden, weeds always have the opportunity to become wheat. The farmer says, no, don't pull them up. Let both grow together until the harvest. And that's the word of the Lord to us today. Let's stand and let's sing together.